Hello, this is Domenico with Easynomics, and we're going to look at per unit subsidies in the context of a real world example, that being cattle production in Brazil. This video can be found in several playlists. If you go down to microeconomics, you can find going back to government intervention, where we cover price controls, indirect taxes, and subsidies. It will also be within the negative externality playlist, and you'll see why in this video. We'll link negative production externalities to subsidies for cattle and how that has led to deforestation in Brazil. And there's also another playlist for real world examples for paper one, paper two type questions. Again, here we have an example of a playlist for government intervention. I have the real world example of subsidies for baladi bread in Egypt as a way to mitigate rising wheat prices during the Russian-Ukrainian war, and also the use of subsidies on gasoline for cars during the Russian-Ukrainian war, leading to rising gasoline prices. There's an article that I'll be referring to by The Guardian, and that article refers to this report, looking at how we can better allocate our land resources for food production and reduce carbon emissions from food waste, and also reduce the trend for deforestation. Within this report, it highlighted that in Brazil, there was a positive relationship between increasing cattle production and deforestation, that farmers receiving subsidies to produce more cattle would clear land so that cattle can have space and graze on the land and so forth. From 2005 onward, Brazil, um, as it says here, used advanced satellite monitoring systems and robust enforcement to ensure that they were able to reduce the level of deforestation, which seemed to have an effect. But from 2012, it seems to be ticking up again. So let's take a look at a couple of articles that talks about these subsidies. Here's an article from The Guardian about from 8 years ago. Subsidies to industries that cause deforestation. The value of those subsidies are 100 times greater than aid from foreign nations to prevent that from happening. So there's a big disconnect between subsidies being provided, $40 billion in subsidies to industries that drive rainforest destruction, versus 346 million, very small in comparison, that's being sent to conserve that land. So there's an incentive to use the greater subsidy money to deforest and produce, as opposed to conserve. Brazil and Indonesia spent over 100 times more in subsidies to industries that cause deforestation. So that's a negative production externality. Two countries handed out over $40 billion to the palm oil, timber, soy, beef, biofuel sectors from 2009 to 2012, which was greater than the 346 million they received to preserve their rainforests, with money being sent from Norway and Germany. Okay. More than half of the world's forest that has been lost between 1990 and 2010, just within that 20-year period, took place in just these two countries, Brazil and Indonesia. There's another article from The Guardian that looked at the amount of subsidies being provided globally, and it quantified that there's $1 million being spent a minute on farm subsidies that are destroying the world through deforestation. So as we cut those forests, we're reducing the ability of those forests to reabsorb the carbon that's being emitted into the atmosphere from our industries. And thus, it's contributing to climate change. All right, so another very interesting article. I'll probably have these articles linked in the video notes below. And in the video notes below, I'll also have outlines to the analysis and evaluation. Okay, so these will be the real world examples that I'll be using. Also, I wanted to mention here, this report, it rejected the idea that subsidies are needed to supply cheap food. We'll see in the model that it reduces price for consumers for food, but the cost, the overallocation that it results, will lead to the marginal social cost being greater than the marginal social benefit, the marginal cost being greater than the benefit that generates a welfare loss. All right, so let's go ahead and begin to illustrate this. You'll see in the model that I'll be using, I can combine another idea that was introduced when we looked at supply and demand, non-price determinants of supply, looking at the idea of joint supply, how an increase in the price of beef leading to an increase in the quantity of its supply, farmers acquiring more cattle, can lead to an increase in the supply for milk. So I'll use that and then connect it again to the idea of subsidies, and then connect that to the idea of the government intervening and actually subsidizing a negative production externality. So here we have our model. We're looking at government intervention, applications of per unit subsidies, and then we're going to again connect that to the idea of how the government's generating a negative production externality, leading to deforestation in Brazil, limiting the ability of Brazil to perhaps meet their climate goals, preserve rainforests to reabsorb the carbon emitted into the atmosphere, and so on. So graph A is the market for beef in Brazil, and we'll put an applied subsidy as we saw in those articles. Graph B, the market for milk in Brazil, linking that as a joint supply to beef. So we have price measured on the y-axis and quantity being measured on the x-axis. I'll draw my upward sloping supply curve in both models. That would be supply equal to marginal cost. So I'll call it S1 equal to the marginal cost of production. And I'll call this S3 equal to the marginal cost of production. Then we'll have a price set. Well, actually, I'll put the demand curve in for graph A. We have demand here being equal to the marginal benefit. And then we'll have the equilibrium where S1 equals D1. Price equilibrium is established and the quantity equilibrium is established. Here we have price equilibrium, quantity equilibrium. I'll call this point A. And then similarly, I'll just establish a comparable price for milk and its quantity. Okay. I'll label this, let's say we'll label this just P1 and quantity of Q1. This will be, maybe I'll label this point D for now. All right, so as we saw in that article, Brazil is subsidizing cattle production, leading to an increase perhaps in the market for beef. Farmers in Brazil are always operating along their S1 curve. The S1 curve includes the costs, the marginal costs of land resources, and the cost being rent paid to acquire land, cut down rainforests so that cattle can graze on that land, labor resources, which includes wages, and any capital resources, machinery, and so forth that we classify as rent. So these are all costs of production that exists on the S1 curve. So the distance between S1 and the x-axis is the sum of all those costs of production. Okay, and so we're going to assume that the Brazilian government comes in and they're going to provide a subsidy for each additional unit of beef that's being produced in the cattle industry. And so that's going to encourage farmers to increase the quantity of their supply along their supply curve. All right, and because of that, they're getting a higher price to cover their marginal costs that are increasing. So we can label this P and P, price received by the producer from the Brazilian government to increase their quantity of supply. So the quantity increases from QE to quantity with subsidy. That will lower the price for consumers in Brazil. So we have a price for consumer at PC. So we're going from point A to point B. Farmers are acquiring that funding from the Brazilian government, increasing their quantity supply, acquiring more cattle, cutting down rainforests from point A to B. Their marginal costs of production are increasing. They're acquiring more capital, land, and labor resources. So point B illustrates the marginal cost of producing a quantity at Q sub, but the subsidy enables the farmer to reduce their price to the consumer to point C. All right, so consumers pay a price of, let's just say for hypothetical reasons, $10. But let's say that the value of the subsidy is $10. The cost of production here is 20. 20 that includes the costs of the subsidy. Right, from here to here we have $10, and then this is the price paid by the consumer, 10. So everything is covered at point B. The marginal costs are covered with the subsidy and with the price paid by the consumer. All right, so that's the idea with the subsidy there. Okay, let me see if I can just clean this up a bit. Okay. Oops. All right. There we go. Okay. So in terms of joint supply, here we see the price increasing. We see an increase in price received by producers with that government intervention, going from PE to P and P, the price received by the producer. That leads to an increase in the quantity of supply from point A to B. As a result of farmers acquiring more beef, that enables them, in the period that they're feeding them, allowing them to graze, to also generate milk. So we can assume that although the price of milk is being held constant at P1, since more cattle is being acquired by farmers, we would expect an increase in the supply of milk from S3 to S4. So I'll draw a supply curve shifting outward from S3 to S4 for milk. Okay, so this is an example of a non-price determinant of supply. The price of milk has not changed, but its supply has increased due to the increase in price for beef. Okay, so holding price constant, P1, takes us to point E. And we see an overall quantity of supply along the new supply curve of S4 increasing from Q1 to Q2. Okay, so there we can connect how the subsidy leads to joint supply in the case of beef and milk in Brazil. Okay, if I was to put a demand curve in here, I could assume that the price of milk would fall. The excess supply would put downward pressure on milk prices, and the price would eventually fall. So I would assume that to take place, right? To really, let's see, from our original demand curve, we'll put that in here. And we can see with the demand being placed in, demand, let's say this is D2 equal to marginal benefit 2. The excess supply puts downward pressure on price, and we would expect in the long run the price of milk to fall. So the subsidy has the effect of making beef cheaper for consumers in Brazil, and also making milk cheaper for consumers in Brazil. So if that's a necessity that we want to encourage more consumption of, make it more affordable, then the subsidy has that effect. Q1, Q2, Q3. Here we go from A, B, C, D, E, and then final point F. All right. But again, we're just highlighting joint supply. S1, price increases, PE to price received by producer, increase in the quantity supply from point A to B, and that leads to an increase in the supply for milk from S3 to S4, leading to price eventually falling in that case in the long run. Okay. Now let's go back to the subsidy and link it to negative production. First, let's just label some areas so we can discuss and evaluate the impact of this. And we should also include that the subsidy is reducing the cost of production, so the supply curve shifts down. Okay, so here we have S2 equal to S1 minus the subsidy provided. So that's your typical subsidy model. I'll first analyze graph A in terms of a subsidy, and then we will evaluate. In graph A, in the market for beef in Brazil, the government is applying a subsidy. On the y-axis, we're measuring price. On the x-axis, we're measuring quantity. There's a downward sloping demand curve labeled D1 equal to the marginal benefit according to the law of demand. An upward sloping supply curve, S1 equal to the marginal costs of producing beef, which includes land, labor, and capital resources, where S1 equals D1 at point A provides an equilibrium price at PE and equilibrium quantity at QE, a free market equilibrium. The government of Brazil intervenes, applies a per unit subsidy for each unit of beef provided. The government will provide some funding to the farmers that incentivizes farmers to acquire more cattle. So we would expect along the S1 curve, as a result of the price increasing from PE to P&P for producers, an increase in the quantity supply from point A to point B. That would have the effect of enabling farmers to reduce their cost of production. The supply curve shifts downward. You can also say it shifts outward by the amount of the subsidy from S1 to S2. S2 equals S1 minus the subsidy. And that would have the effect of reducing the price for consumers from PE to PC, price paid by the consumer. That leads to an increase in the quantity of demand from QE to Q sub, which is a movement along the demand curve from point A to point C. It should also be mentioned that milk is jointly supplied with beef. So if there is an increase in price for beef, there's an increase in its quantity of supply, which would lead to an increase in the supply of milk in graph B from S3 to S4, holding price constant P1. We can see that's a non-price determinant of supply, joint supply. In the long run, though, in graph B, because of the excess supply, that would put downward pressure on price from P1 to P2, leading to a long-run equilibrium at Q3 or point F. Okay, back to graph A. Let's evaluate how are consumers and producers impacted. Let's first look at consumer surplus before the intervention. Consumer surplus following the demand curve to the equilibrium price was areas A plus B. But consumers pay a lower price thanks to the subsidy. And so that has the effect of increasing their consumer surplus by additional areas of G, F, and E. Oops, let's see if I can redo that. So consumers are better off because their consumer surplus increases thanks to the reduced price. We can imagine, just so we understand this subsidy a little bit better, right? If I was to take the subsidy, that's the amount of money being paid by the government for this subsidy. You can divide this into these areas. It's like cutting slices from a cake or a piece of pie or something. All right, so here I'll label again areas B, C, D, E, F, and G. So out of this total amount of government spending on the subsidy, the consumers get areas B, F, and E from that subsidy money, the increased savings to consumers. Okay, next, let's move on to the producers. So following this original supply curve, producer surplus was originally areas G and H. And due to the increased price received by producers, they gain an additional area of B and C. This is not being taken from the consumer. This is being taken from the subsidy. So producers get this additional area of B plus C from the government subsidy money. Okay, what's left over? Area D. Area D illustrates the welfare loss, where at quantity sub, the marginal cost is greater than the marginal benefit. So at Q sub, marginal cost is greater than marginal benefit. That's an over allocation of resources to farmers to produce more than what is actually desired by society in Brazil or global society as we try to tackle deforestation and climate change and so forth. Again, in the article, I think I have it here. Is it here? In this article from The Guardian, it highlights $1 million a minute being provided in farming subsidies, which is destroying the world. It highlights that in this study, the report rejects the idea that subsidies are needed to supply cheap food. It found that the cost of the damage currently caused by agriculture is greater than the value of the food produced. Costs are greater than the benefit derived by society. So that's the idea here, MC greater than MB at Q sub. There's an over allocation. We should reduce it. Some other points, we can also talk about producers in terms of total revenue. Total revenue was initially, in this case for the farmers, if I have some space here, total revenue initial, or 1, was equal to PE times QE, and then total revenue increases to price received by producer times Q sub. So total revenue 2 is greater than total revenue 1. So it's another reason why farmers in Brazil are better off with the subsidy from their point of view. But we have this welfare loss of area D. So the Brazilian government has subsidized farming, and it provides these benefits to consumers and producers. But in that study, it highlights that the government interventions actually led to a negative production externality. So we can add that to our knowledge here. Instead of saying MC over MB, we can say that marginal cost equals the marginal social cost. Actually, this goes, the marginal social cost. Here I can state this is marginal social cost at point B is greater than, I can say that this is marginal social benefit at point C, greater than marginal social benefit. So we can see that the government has subsidized a negative production externality. At Q sub, marginal social cost greater than marginal social benefit. At Q sub, marginal social cost greater than marginal social benefit. The government is subsidizing a negative production externality, which we see in this triangular area here. So what would be the solution? The government should remove the subsidy, have the supply curve S2 shift back into S1, where we're at S1 equals D1, providing that equilibrium free market price of PE and quantity QE, where marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit. All right, so that's just using those articles from The Guardian, looking at the impact of subsidies, how subsidies has led to an overallocation, leading to a negative production externality, and how that can be corrected by removing those subsidies according to those reports and those articles from The Guardian. Okay, and that's it. If you have any questions, you can comment those questions below, and don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.